So it's a pleasure to have Professor Jonathan Wight for our last talk of this semester about what economics should know about ethics in 1 hour and a half. Jonathan is Professor of Economics with joint appointment in International Studies at the University of Richmond. Professor Wight has published several articles on ethics and the relation with economics and efficiency in journals such as Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of Economics, Education, and Social Economy. He is the author of the book Ethics in Economics, An Introduction to Moral Framework, and Sailing Adam Smith, A Tale of Wealth, Transformation, and Virtue. Thank you, Jonathan, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Buenos dias. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. Is this working? Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here. I look forward to Hello? Bien?
Sólido.
¿Aló? ¿Está bien? Bueno, thank you very much for this wonderful invitation to visit your campus and to have a conversation with you about ethics in economics. I have much to learn about Colombia. I will say a few words in my talk about some of the political events in Colombia, some of the questions that you're trying to deal with, but I am completely ill-equipped to reach any kind of conclusions about Colombia. So my job here is to give you perhaps some opening remarks about a conversation that you'll be having in the future with your economics department. And I am here to learn much about Colombia with your help. In any event, the structure of my talk is as follows. I intend to have a brief introduction about why ethics matters to economics. We will then tentatively see how we could go about modeling economics. And then we'll have some examples drawn from both positive economics and normative economics. Economics, raise your hand if you are now a student of economics. Oh, excellent. Because economics is the queen of the social sciences. So you can be very proud of the work that you are doing. I never will forget the day in the first class in economics, which I think was actually my third economics class, when suddenly the light bulbs in my mind went off, when I made the great connection of the power of economic logic to help me understand the world. And it was a wonderful moment that I've never forgotten. And I hope that you also will have such a moment in your academic careers, where you will see that economics really can help us understand the world, and it's a wonderful subject to be a part of. Now, starting in around the 1930s, and maybe even earlier than that, economics began to be a very technical subject. And that is part of what I want to talk about today, is that technical nature of economics moved us farther away from what economics was originally at the time of our founding with Adam Smith. In the 18th century, economics was part of moral science, and it has moved away from that. And my talk today is to try to encourage you to think about why economics might want to open up a little bit and allow the moral science back into the technical science of economics. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this subject of ethics in economics. I know exactly the day and year. It was in 1995. I went to a bookstore in my city of Richmond, Virginia, and I was exploring. Let me say one other thing before I start. If you don't understand my English, please stop me, and I will try to speak slower and clearer, but thank you. So I was in a bookstore, and I was reading in the economics section, and there was a book by Adam Smith, the founder of our discipline, but the book was not The Wealth of Nations, which you've all heard of. This was a book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And I thought, well, I've heard of this book, but I don't know what's in it. I don't think I'll ever read it, but it looks pretty, and it was inexpensive, and I think it would look good in my library. So I took it home, and it was about 9 o'clock at night, and I thought, well, I'll open it up, but it's philosophy, so it's going to be very boring. So why would I'm sure I'm not going to want to read much. And I opened the book, and I couldn't stop reading. One of the most exciting books I've ever read. And I go back to it over and over and over again because of that excitement, because of the insight that Adam Smith had into human nature. And what I did at that point was another professor of economics was also interested in this. So we started a reading group on campus. And maybe you can do something like that on this campus. We got professors from economics, from political science, from psychology, from religion, from sociology, and other areas. And we spent a whole year reading the same book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And we learned so much. And by the way, this was supported by our administration who bought the copies of the book for us. So just make a note of that. And also bought us lunch occasionally. But anyway, that's how I got started on Adam Smith's idea that ethics permeates human nature and life, and therefore it's essential if we want to understand the invisible hand and the workings of markets. And then shortly after that, I went on a sabbatical to Silicon Valley in California to write a book called Saving Adam Smith, where I wanted to write, it's actually a novel in which Adam Smith comes back to life and he talks about the importance of ethics in the role of creating wealth. And just as I was about to leave, my dean, the chief academic officer of at my school, came into my office and he said, "Why are you wasting your time on ethics? You're an economist." And I said, well, because it was important to Adam Smith. I think he's convinced me it's important to me. And I have tenure, so ciao. So I went off. But then it was 2 years later, the Enron crisis happened, which was a major financial business scandal in America. And it was at that point that the dean brought me out to all the visitors, say, "See, we do ethics here at the business school." So I think it really is important, what I'm trying to say. Now, the other motivation for this talk is from the American Economic Association, which 2 years after I picked up the theory of moral sentiments, the American Economic Association did a study of graduate school curriculum and methods and what the students were learning, and they said, you know, we are turning out idiot savants, people who are skilled in technique, but they're innocent of real economic issues. They're getting the technical training without the moral context. So they're not prepared to be leaders. This was a very powerful critique. And the American Economic Association was not the only one making this critique. This is Ronald Coase, the University of Chicago, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1991. It is suicidal for the field of economics to slide into a hard science of choice, ignoring the influences of society, history, culture, and politics on the workings of the economy. Knowledge will come only if economics can be reoriented to the study of man as he is, and the economic system as it actually exists. So here's a question for you to see how alert you are so far. Your ship has just become stuck on a foreign and apparently deserted land. There are no human predators. What material substance is most necessary to sustain your life here for the longest amount of time? I'd like you to raise your hand. Quickly, who says it's drinkable water? Who says it is edible food? Who says it is shelter from the rain? Who says something else? And the correct answer, of course, you must have known this was a trick. The correct answer is something else: air. Our ship is the Starship Enterprise, and we're somewhere in the solar system, we're not sure where. But in any event, ethics is this invisible force like air. We can't live without it. We can't get along as a society without it. And yet, economists typically forget about it when you're talking about your production function. And I hope to have you think differently about it as we go along today. So, my claim is that ethics matters both to positive economics, predicting and understanding the world, as well as to normative economics, recommending public policies. Let me give you some examples. This is a car called the Chevrolet Malibu. It was being built in the 1990s by a major American corporation. And the problem was that General Motors, making the car, knew that they had a problem with the fuel tank. And that in a rear-end collision, this car had a likelihood of the fuel escaping and exploding and causing people's death and disfigurement. And how do we know that they knew that information? Because we have, when it came to trial, they had engineering studies showing exactly that they knew what the problem was. And the jury found out about this and awarded about $5 billion in damages. The jury was irate that General Motors had known about it and did nothing about it. But General Motors was only thinking at the margin. They were doing basic economics. So General Motors had calculated that to fix the fuel tank would cost $8.59 per car, but that the savings that they would get, the benefit, would only be $2.40. This is in the wrongful death claims that they would have to pay out. And so the economic solution to them was to not fix the car. Nor did they tell the customer that the car had a problem. Now, the jury reacted with moral outrage. Now let's bring in Milton Friedman, very famous economist, Nobel Prize winner. He is somebody who has said the role of the manager at a company like General Motors is to make as much money for the stockholders as possible. That's the moral thing to do. And he believed that this would make, in the grand scheme of things, profit is good because it's allocating resources to the things that people desire most. But Milton Friedman was quite explicit in saying that the manager should make as much money as possible. This is a direct quote. Conforming to the basic rules of the society, both those embodied in law and those embodied in ethical custom. Profit maximization is good. It's a very good thing in the right circumstances. And one of those right circumstances is you're in an ethical system and you are obliged as a manager to obey ethical rules in addition to legal rules. So General Motors did not tell their customers about the problem. That was a huge moral lapse. So ethics is the study of right and wrong, and if people have strong beliefs about what is right and wrong, as the jury did, then that can affect behavior in the markets. It can also affect the selection of public policies. Here's another few examples. In the United States, people typically pay a tip at restaurants of about 15 to 20%. Why do they do that? They're not required by law to do it, but they do it anyway. And one good answer that economists come up with is, it's in our self-interest to pay a tip. because I'm going to be coming back to that restaurant and I want good service. And if I don't pay a tip, the waiter is going to give me bad service the next time. That is a very good answer. It has to do with the incentives. But why do people tip at highway restaurants? These are restaurants you'll never go to again. You'll never encounter that same waiter again, and yet people traditionally pay 15 to 20%. And the answer is they do it out of ethical custom or habit. And this is what virtue ethics is about. Virtue ethics is about developing habits that are appropriate. Or they do it as a commitment to a principle that tipping is the right action regardless of whether I get a future benefit from it or not. Let me give you another example. In 1994, a woman and her friend were murdered in Los Angeles, and a very famous actor and athlete, O.J. Simpson, was accused and tried for the murders. He was not convicted because of a lack of evidence. And then later, in 2006, he wrote a book. If I did it, here's how I did it. And this is a book about how he had murdered them and gotten away with it. The publisher was going to make a lot of money. The publisher had printed 400,000 copies of the book. They were ready to go on sale. A lot of people wanted to buy the book. And yet, the release of the idea of the book caused such a problem in society, such an outpouring of outrage, that the publisher withdrew the book from circulation. Now, just to be clear, O.J. Simpson could not be tried for the same crime twice, so he was acquitted the first time, which meant he couldn't be tried again. The standard economic view is that wealth is created when markets are efficient and people get to buy what they want within the limits of their income. Buyers and sellers are satisfying their preferences to share in the marketplace. There were a lot of people who wanted to buy the book. There were people who wanted to sell the book through voluntary trade, and yet the book was not allowed to get into print. And the reason has something to do with the moral limits to markets. There are some kinds of activities or some kinds of products in which people, you, maybe me, have concerns about the background circumstances of trade, whether somebody to the transaction was coerced, or we have a repugnance at selling particular kinds of goods and services that embody beliefs about intrinsic values and the corruption of those intrinsic values. In this case, the act of trying to sell the book apparently outraged the public's sense of justice. Justice is an ideal. It's often not achieved. But the ideal of justice is that if you commit a bad crime, you should pay the penalty for committing that crime. You shouldn't get rich from committing a crime. Paul Samuelson, another Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, "Do not render unto the market that which is not the market's." That is, there are some things that should not be for sale. Don't have the markets try to do that. Elizabeth Anderson has written a book about this, Value in Ethics and Economics, looking at how do values and incentives, price incentives, interact. Should children be for sale in the market? Raise your hand if you think children should be for sale. What about votes in your upcoming presidential and other elections? Should those votes be for sale? Should you be able to sell your vote? What about, as students, should you be able to buy a grade? Isn't an A grade scarce? Don't we solve problems of scarcity by markets? Why don't we let the price system work? And those who can afford or are willing to buy, let them buy their A's. And what about justice, to return to O.J. Simpson? Should rich people be able to buy an escape from prison or escape from conviction? Or should they not? Now, if you're thinking that you would be unhappy about the market selling these things, then you are somebody who believes that there should be moral limits to markets. Two famous economists, Elizabeth Landis and Richard Posner, wrote an article in 1978 arguing that babies should be for sale. And here's an example I made up. Beautiful little baby girl, 6 weeks old. She's bottle trained, $12,999, sold on eBay. Now, their argument is that the buying parents might be richer than the biological parents and might therefore provide better care than and education and various other things than the parents. But does selling a child for profit violate intrinsic beliefs about the nature of motherhood and fatherhood? And what are the duties and obligations of a parent? Does it violate norms of human rights to treat a baby as merely an object to be sold? And if you are willing to say it's okay to sell a baby, well, what about selling a young girl? Or then what about selling an adult? Indeed, what about slavery itself? Amartya Sen, who's been one of the strongest voices for ethics in economics, and his book came out in 1998 on this subject, has said, consequential analysis, by which he means cost and benefit analysis, that's what Posner and Landis were doing in arguing for the baby's sale. They were saying the costs and benefits should be considered and the baby would be better off being with a different parent. And Amartya Sen would say that kind of analysis may be necessary, but it's not sufficient for many moral decisions. So I'm going to be trying to open the lens of acceptable analysis in economics to say we should be widening the lens to go beyond consequentialist analysis. Michael Sandel at Harvard has become quite famous for this and other books, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets. And I want to suggest if we want to start developing a framework for understanding when there are moral limits to markets, it's obviously changing over time. It's not something that is static, it's dynamic, it's changing all the time. So what are the circumstances in which we are less likely to say it's okay to allow the market to price things and allocate resources? Well, typically we would say if it's your close friend and they want to buy your car, you might not maximize the price at sale. You might try to give them a break, particularly if you know they have a financial need. Or if they're in a social group, like at churches, schools, and fraternities. At my university, for example, when we have registration for classes, there are some classes that are more popular than others. What you could do if you were the registrar is raise the tuition price for the more popular classes, right? But we don't do that. Instead, we have first come, first serve, or we have favoritism based on your class standing. If you are a senior, you get preference over a junior, and so on. Or in times of crisis, we prefer to deal with non-market solutions. Or in times of vulnerability, if you're talking about children or the elderly or the sick. Or if you're greatly concerned about principles of equality. Now, economists have a very critical role to play in identifying the hidden costs and benefits of public policies. And we can talk about the problems with any of these non-market solutions, like price controls, cause all kinds of unintended consequences. And part of a good moral education of every student would be to try to understand what are all the hidden effects of allocating resources using non-market mechanisms. And it's great to have a conversation about all of these kinds of issues. There's a growing literature in economics about something called motivational crowding out, and this is where introducing the market actually results in less of a supply of the thing you're interested in promoting. This is true of blood donations, comparing the English system where they don't pay to the American system where we do. Oftentimes, you get more blood donations, according to the claims of these authors, you get more blood donations of a higher quality when people donate blood because they see themselves as being a good person doing the right thing for the right reason, rather than simply for money. In the citing of Swiss nuclear waste, when they asked citizens, would you be willing to have this nuclear waste facility in your community if it would help the country? And about half the people said yes. And then they asked them, well, if we paid you $6,000, now would more people be willing? And the answer is fewer people are willing to participate when you offer them money to site that nuclear facility. Because now you're changing it from a moral question of what's my duty to my country to what's an economic transaction worth to me. And the last one is an Israeli daycare center. They had a problem of parents coming late to pick up their children. So they hired an economist to solve the problem, and the economist said, well, if they're doing something bad, charge them a fee for showing up late. So you're taxing them, you should get less of the bad behavior. Did more parents show up late after the fee was introduced? Yes, because now this transaction is no longer a moral transaction. It's my duty to get to the school on time so the teachers can get home. Now it's simply an economic transaction, and I'm going to choose to buy more lead time. Hello? Oh, there we go. So informal and formal rules guide how people are supposed to behave, including in markets. And one very famous example is Nike's use of child labor in manufacturing, which used to be perfectly okay. In fact, Milton Friedman said his mother worked in a sweatshop in New York, and he thought it was a good thing she had a chance to get a job, and that was an opportunity. But the moral conditions change. What was morally acceptable in 1900 are not morally acceptable in 2018. So moral limits change over time. As you know, in Colombia, Santo Peter Claver, who lived from 1580 to 1654, was very interested in helping slaves. And that started a conversation that to some degree is still going on. Here is Pope Francis last year. And the moral limits to markets are changing right here in Bogota, as I understand. You're having a debate about bullfighting. Well, bullfighting may be a little less popular than it used to be, but someone can still make money at it. So if all we're concerned about is economic efficiency, we would say, let's make as much wealth as we can. And we would do that by allowing people to have the bullfights if they want, and those who want to go can buy. But the reason we're having a debate is we're saying there are moral limits to markets. It's not, to some people, they would say it's not acceptable to force an animal to suffer in order for somebody to make a profit. I am not here to settle that debate. I am here to give you a framework for trying to understand this and other kinds of debates. We start on the left with the economic actor. Who is this person that is about to do something? And what is the action that they want to take, and what are the outcomes that will be produced from that action? Economists are all the way on the right-hand side. What we focus on are outcomes, and in particular, the expected costs and benefits. But costs and benefits for who? And how do we measure the costs and benefits? As it turns out, it's quite problematic because there are lots of different ways, lots of different values or goals in society. So whose interests count when we're doing the costs and benefits? Ethical egoists would say the only thing that matters are the costs and benefits to me. And most philosophers won't take you very far. There are some, like Ayn Rand, who would support ethical egoism. But utilitarians, from the time of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and on upward to today, utilitarians would say, no, that's not right. We have to consider not just your own costs and benefits, but the costs and benefits to society at large. And in particular, a utilitarian would also say, including the rights of animals, not the rights, but the costs and benefits to animals. And utilitarians would say we can measure the costs and benefits not by the dollar votes cast in the marketplace, but by the pleasures or the happiness created on balance by some outcome. Economists are different. We would say we can't measure pleasures and happiness directly, but we can measure how much people are willing to spend and market, and that is our metric by which we calculate efficiency, that is the maximization of consumer surplus or wealth creation. But we know Colombia is also very interested in peace and security. That's an outcome that matters quite greatly. Or you could be someone who's very much interested in freedom, or in fairness, or justice. So, as it turns out, when you say you're a consequentialist, you're saying, I believe that public policy ideas can be decided on the basis of the outcomes, or the ethics of something can be decided on the basis of the outcomes. But it still becomes very complicated because there are lots of different outcomes and ways of measuring that. It's going to get a little more complicated because there are plenty of people who would say it's not just the outcomes that matter, it's how we address the process of getting to the outcomes. And in this, we were very worried about what are the principles that guide our behavior, and what are the duties and rules that might arise in such activity. So just as in outcome-based ethics, there are lots of different ways of being an outcome-based ethicist. Under duties and rules, there are lots of different ways of following the duties and rules. Your duties and rules could come from God in the Ten Commandments, or the 613 Judaic rules from the Torah. Or it could come from, in my own case, from the Constitution of the United States. Our first 10 commandments lay out basic human rights: the right to free speech, to assemble, to not be unfairly punished, to not have your assets seized without just cause, etc., etc. And then, of course, we have Kantian duties. Many philosophers are Kantians. They believe that we can derive duties logically. God gave us a mind, and Kant said, let's use our mind to derive the rules under which we could say are ethical. And those rules basically are: never make an exception for yourself, treat others as equals, and in your actions never treat others merely as a means to your own ends, but as ends in themselves. And now we get to the third way of looking at what is ethical, and that is to say, let's examine the motives and intentions of the economic actor and see where that leads us. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. We could talk about Confucian ethics in China. We could talk about Buddhist ethics in India. We could talk about Aristotelian virtue ethics in the Western tradition. And we could talk about my friend Adam Smith and his ethics. Aristotle wrote, "We are not concerned to know what goodness is, but how to become good people, since otherwise our inquiry would be useless." So a virtue ethicist is saying, it's all very good to have duties, but how do we get a person to carry out their duties? A person will carry out their duties only if they have a virtuous character. And Aristotle thought about eudaimonia, or human flourishing through excellence, and this comes about through the four cardinal virtues of courage, prudence, temperance, and justice. St. Thomas Aquinas added 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And character is about acquiring habits that are virtuous rather than doing any specific act. It requires lots of practice, and it requires a lot of self-control. We learn virtue by making mistakes. Virtue is the golden mean between excess and deficiency, so we can talk about what does it mean to be courageous in Colombia. It means you are not reckless, nor are you a coward. How do we discover that balance? It's very hard, and only through making mistakes. This is one of the most profound moments that I can think about in my life on this day in November in 1985, when I first heard about the 12, I think, justices of the Supreme Court who were killed, and a number of other people were killed. And I don't pretend to understand all the different arguments, between the M19 and the government, and it's a very complicated story. There's a lot of work to do. The Justice and Reconciliation Committee has done a lot of work. So I don't pretend to understand it at all. I'm just saying that my heart was deeply moved by the courage of anybody in Colombia who would be a justice. Because in being a justice, you are standing up sometimes to very powerful interests, and you are risking your life. And I would say the same thing about a journalist. And I would say the same thing about a student or a professor. Adam Smith wrote a lot about the virtue of prudence. And to Adam Smith, prudence is the golden mean between the excess of your egoism and the deficiency of self-hating. So in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith says we should be prudent. We should be looking out for our own interests, in the sense that we should care about how we maintain our own lives in the future. That's an important thing. As a virtuous person, you should worry about maintaining yourself. You shouldn't rely on others for handouts, if you're able to work anyway. But that doesn't mean that prudence in Adam Smith, that when you're looking out for your own self-interest in a prudent, virtuous way, that means you're egoistic or selfish. He doesn't mean that at all. Because a selfish person has no self-control, and Adam Smith thought that the premier virtue was self-control. Now, virtue ethics exists and thrives within a particular context of society and culture. It's not an individualistic approach, nor is it an absolute approach. So many of the duties that we say we have from the Ten Commandments or from Kantian duties, these are absolute. They don't ever change. Whereas virtue ethics does change over time as our moral imagination evolves. So here is how Adam Smith saw virtue playing into the economic system. First of all, Adam Smith thought that our knowledge or understanding of ethics arises from our feelings about what is right and what is wrong. So his book was called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. A theory meaning a generalization, moral about right and wrong, and sentiments about your feelings. And he thought that from an early age, we have the instinct to feel what other people are feeling. A baby's looking at a mother's face, and that baby is picking up clues about how the mother is feeling at that point in time. And the baby not only has the instinct to do that, the baby has a second instinct. That instinct is to get into equilibrium with the mother's feelings. And this equilibrium is what gives rise to self-control. I'll give you a quick example. When a baby is very young and comes right out of the womb, what is the baby doing quickly? What's the first thing the baby does? Cry. The baby is saying, me, help me. I want shelter, I want food, I want protection. That's very selfish. So we all come out with the instinct that is thoroughly selfish. But over time, our brains continue to develop, and our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes begins to arise in our mental faculties and our emotional faculties. So at a certain point in time, at a certain age, let's say 2.5, 3, the child is sitting at the table and they take their food and they hit their brother with it. Is the mother in emotional equilibrium with the baby's action? Yes or no? No. The baby has behaved wrongly. So the mother withholds her sympathy from the baby. What you did was wrong. The child feels that break in sympathy, and the child then feels the pain from that break in sympathy, and the child eventually begins to learn that hitting her brother is wrong. And then over time, if she's well socialized, she comes to internalize the view that hitting her brother is wrong. She knows this deeply, in a deep emotional way. This is not logic. This is not exactly cost-benefit analysis. This is not Kantian ethics. This is Adam Smith's version of virtue ethics. And it has to do with our feelings that give rise to our understanding about right and wrong. So, we have equilibrium in moral sentiments, and Adam Smith does not trust your sentiments. He doesn't trust my sentiments either, because he's worried that we might still be too self-focused. But he believes that over time and many generations and many people, the moral sentiments of many people are a good guide to what should be the laws and rules of your society, which are constraining your actions. So the shared social norms of ethical behavior arise. These are what economists call institutions. And in economics, we have formal institutions and we have informal institutions. And these are obviously informal institutions that guide behavior. So if, for example, you have shared moral sentiments that say that cheating is wrong or stealing is wrong, and you believe very deeply this feeling that stealing is wrong, and this gives rise to norms of behavior in your community that you should not steal, then Adam Smith would say that would give rise to some really good outcomes in society. Now this is from The Wealth of Nations, where Smith uses the invisible hand. Thus, upon equal or nearly equal profits, every wholesale merchant naturally prefers the home trade to the foreign trade of consumption. He can know better the character and situation of the persons whom he trusts. And if he should happen to be deceived, he better knows the laws of the country from which he must seek redress. Adam Smith is trying to understand whether government should impose a law against exporting capital. And Smith is saying, no, you don't need such a law because entrepreneurs will naturally leave their capital closer to home. Why would they leave it closer to home? Because we do business with people whose character we know. So, character and trust, along with good legal system, lower the transaction costs in trade and result in more possibilities for mutually beneficial transactions and higher incomes. But there are two different kinds of trust. There's the standard economic view of trust, in which we would say it's calculated. This is enlightened self-interest trust. So it might be that I am a crook, but I will pretend to be trustworthy so that I could get your repeat business. So in a competitive market, if there is repeat business, repeat play in a game, I don't have to be ethical to act ethically. But to Adam Smith, it was quite different. Adam Smith thought that, in fact, you get a different quality of trust when it comes from the moral sentiments. And let me ask you a question. If you were going to start up in a business with a partner, and you have partner A, who you believe to be greedy and selfish, and who is unprincipled, and who is calculating whether or not to be honest with you in his dealings with you, and is always making a calculation, should I steal from my partner today? Should I steal from my partner tomorrow? That's type A. Or type B, someone you have an intensely emotional sharing of sympathy from which you are very sure that this person abhors theft as much as you do and will abide by the principle that stealing is bad. I think I know your answer, which kind of person you would trust, and I know there's honor among thieves, we say, but Adam Smith still thought it was very important. Okay, now, if we in fact can achieve better outcomes for society if people develop an ethical character, then that's going to have spillover effects on the moral sentiments or the feelings about right and wrong. John Stuart Mill wrote about this when he talked about the advantages of foreign trade. One of the strongest advantages of foreign trade was that you would encounter people who are different from you. And that would change your moral imagination and make you more accepting of other people in society, and that's one of the great benefits. Now, I should hasten. Is this mic still working? Okay.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that Amartya Sen has worried about, and that Adam Smith himself worried about, is that people would simply say that all of this is just about the same as doing business before, or a modern economist could say, I can stick all of this in a utility function. And Amartya Sen would say, you cannot. And in fact, Adam Smith wrote, he didn't know about utility functions, but he knew the basic idea, and he said, you can't do this. For one thing, preferences are not outside the model, they're not autonomous. The shaping of preferences for right and wrong is a key part of proper socialization, and it's the moral sentiments or feelings are felt before the mind has time to calculate any gains or losses. So this is a different process than an outcome-based ethics in which you're calculating costs and benefits. Adam Smith is also called the father of behavioral economics because he wrote that the rational mind is weak compared to the instincts. So where does this leave us with regard to economic development? Well, if you're a good economist, you're worried about capital, physical capital, human capital, social capital, and now to add one more little thing to your list, moral capital, which is the shared stock of trust and ethical habits. Okay, let's talk now about doing economics. How do average people actually act? And does it have any relevance to what we've been saying? And second, how do economists themselves act? Now this is an experiment done by Vernon Smith and a few others. Vernon Smith, as you know, won the Nobel Prize in 2002. And this is called the Voluntary Trust Game. And two individuals are behind the computer screen. They don't see each other. They don't know each other. It's all anonymous play. They will never know who the other person is. It's a one-time play. There's no ability to build a reputation, anything else. It's just a one-shot game. Player one can take an immediate payout for himself and the other person of $20 each. Or player one can pass the choice on to player two, and player two can then choose $25 for each of them. But player two could also change the outcome by taking $30 for herself and $15 for the other player. Now we can do backward induction to see where does this leave us. If you're in standard economics, you will assume that player number two is not going to cooperate. You're going to assume that player two is going to defect. And therefore, player number one, knowing for sure that player two is going to defect, will always choose the first option to go for the 20 and the 20. So standard economic thinking, using an outcome-based ethic, can get you to this answer that everybody, most of the time, is going to choose the first option. Well, here are the actual results. Only 37% of people actually chose the economic solution. So if you're an economist, you've got to be wondering, I've come up with a model, but that model is violated 2/3 of the time by actual people like you. And so almost 2/3 of the individuals, one, passed the choice on to player number two, and player number two, about 2/3 of the time, chose the 25-25. Again, that violates what economists think, how we should behave. Now, Vernon Smith, in trying to understand these outcomes, basically said, okay, well, one approach is to say, maybe in the utility function of these people, there is a preference for other regarding behaviors, like people may have a preference for altruism. They simply like giving money away to other people. Or maybe people have a preference in their utility function for fairness. But Vernon Smith says, maybe there's something else. Maybe virtue matters. That is, maybe people care about the intentions and motives of others, independent of those outcomes. So he repeated the game, but this time, this is called the involuntary trust game. In this case, player number one is not given the opportunity to signal player number two. The computer automatically sends the choice to player number two. Player number two knows that there's a player number one. So if player number two is really altruistic, that is, wants to give money away, player number two should do exactly the same as before. Or if player number two believes in greater equality, player number two will continue to do exactly as before. But if virtue matters, that is, if motives and intentions play a part in our feelings about right and wrong and how we should behave, then we might expect a different answer. And so this is what we discover in this case, whereas in the first case we had 2/3 of player number twos were opting for 25-25. Now this has flipped. 2/3 of player number two now take the $30, $15 payout. So the results have dramatically changed. Why? Because player number two was not trusted by player number one. In the act of trusting player number two, player number one sent a signal about motives and intentions. And it goes much deeper than that, by the way. Write this name down. I didn't have it in my slideshow for interest of saving time. But Paul Zak in California has been doing interesting biological economic work, studying the release of hormones in your brain when people play these games. When player number one is trusting player number two is receiving a burst chemically of oxytocin in the brain, which is a bonding chemical that makes you feel closer to other people. This is the chemical that's released when women breastfeed or when humans have orgasms. And so this is a chemical support for this idea. Now, Vernon Smith has said the only way you can try to understand this is through Adam Smith's model of the moral sentiments. Smith's non-utilitarian model provides new insights into the results of two-person experimental trust games. Markets economize on the need for virtue but do not eliminate it. Far from championing the individual's pursuit of self-love, Smith saw the individual not even as defined except in a social context. There is no cognitive individual psychology except that it is born of a person's social circumstances, out of the social psychology of his environments. So when you're teaching your students about selfish maximization, are you actually limiting their ability to learn about how to get along in the world? This was an interesting study done by Robert Frank at Cornell, who found that teaching students the economic way of thinking actually lowered earnings across a bunch of different games. There's less cooperation if you approach the world from an economic way of thinking, purely economic way of thinking. Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in 2009. She was a political scientist. She said, rather than a single representative utility maximizing agent, a better foundation for explaining human behavior is the assumption that there are multiple types of individuals. Some of us behaving one way, some of us behaving another. And these exist in most settings, who are motivated both by intrinsic preferences and by material payoffs. So the claim so far has been that in the real world, how we understand right from wrong may make a difference to our understanding of how people actually interact in the real world. And although as scientists we want to develop the most simple model that we can, sometimes we can omit too much. So that's sort of the claim that I'm making, that others have made, is that we need to get economists to pry open just a little bit their models. So self-interest is held in check both by market forces, competition, and incentives, as well as by internal restraints, including conscience and character. And in the messy world of life, decisions are driven by consideration of virtue and motive and duty and expected outcomes. Moral norms arise from feelings or sentiments in addition to rational calculations, and that there are three different ethical frameworks that oftentimes help complete the other ones. So let's turn now to how you behave. You're economists, so you're carrying out economic analyses, and how do you behave? Well, economists are part of a long line of scientists from the Enlightenment period. And if you're a scientist, you're buying into norms of truth-seeking and adherence to duty and virtue in seeking the truth wherever that truth may lead you. And that's slightly different than the ethics of the market. Not that markets don't at times need to understand truth, they do. And also, one of my pet ideas that I was talking earlier with a group of economists here is that entrepreneurs are oftentimes driven by some of the highest values and virtues. And there are plenty of examples in my mind of entrepreneurs who are entirely ethical. But nevertheless, the way we teach our students is we say that in the marketplace, everybody is self-seeking and utility maximizing, and they're not seeking truth, they're seeking profit. And sometimes there's a pretty wide divergence between truth and profit. Now, economists assume that enlightened self-interest will keep researchers honest. That is, they will say, the reason people report the correct results from their study is because if you are discovered to be a cheater, your career is finished. Nobody will ever trust you again. Paul Sanderson noted that it's the social respect that we get. In the long run, the economic scholar works for the only coin worth having, our own applause. But are the incentives sufficient to align virtue ethics with this incentive? Let me suggest that there are a number of market failures in economic research. Now, let me first of all say that I'm not making a case that there's a huge amount of dishonesty. I'm about to argue when we get to the end that I'm surprised by how much honesty there actually is in economic research. Because there's a huge amount of author bias, which is to say we all come into some research project with some idea that came to us from somewhere. Schumpeter talks about these ideologies that enter our brains. We're not always sure where they come from, but we have our own biases. And Upton Sinclair says it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on not understanding it. One of the biggest problems today is that you're an economist, you want to do studies, you have to get funding. Well, who is doing the funding? What is the bias of the group doing the funding? You know about the financial crisis of 2008 and the importance that deregulation of financial markets in the United States played in causing that crisis and leading financial institutions to take on way too much risk. And Charles Ferguson has produced a very interesting movie called The Inside Job, in which he attacks economists, some of whom are some of the most important, powerful people in the economics profession. And he would claim that over the last 30 years, our discipline has been systematically subverted in the same way that politics has by money, especially from the financial services industry. Many of the most prominent economists in America are now paid to testify, to serve on boards of directors, to testify in antitrust cases, to give speeches to the companies and industry they study and write about with supposed objectivity. Now, I think he's a little bit unfair, because in the examples he used of Mishkin at Columbia, and there are some other examples, it's very hard for me to believe that Frederick Mishkin would lie to anybody for $100,000, which is what he was paid, I think, by the council in Iceland to write a review of their financial market, in which he wrote everything is fine in Iceland, and of course 2 years later the entire economy collapsed. But Fred Mishkin has the best-selling textbook in the market for money and banking. He's making a lot more money with his reputation than he is from that consulting. So I think the complaint by Ferguson is a little bit off base, but nevertheless I think it's a really big problem in some context to ask, who is funding your research? Is your research coming from the IMF? Who's it coming from? And what are their interests of the funding authority? And can you, as the writer, express your own mind about what you think the research shows? Second, there's a journal bias. Journals typically publish articles only with statistically significant results. This creates a huge incentive for people to manipulate, fudge, and even invent results. I have an honor student this semester who did very good research, collected her own data set on the Catholic Church and donations to the Catholic Church. She had, I think, a very good model. She had very good data. She got no statistically significant results. Very frustrating. Now, what do the rest of us do when we encounter that kind of thing? We go back and keep testing. We keep changing the model. We keep changing the data. We keep looking to find anything that's statistically significant. Is that scientific? Is that a scientific approach? No, that's not a scientific approach. That's called we're just fudging until we can come up with something that we think can get by the reviewers. Which gets us to the next one, asymmetric information, which is you, the researcher, know a lot more about your research methods than the journal that is possibly going to publish your work. This came to light in my own life on my first book in economics. I was coming up for tenure. The book was not yet out. We did have a publisher. The book, I think, was actually in galley form, and it was a statistical study of several 100,000 healthcare cases and the economic implications of the healthcare. And my co-author had done the statistical work, called me up one day and he said, "John, I've got some bad news." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I discovered an error that I'd made like 6 months ago in coding something. So all of the data in the book is wrong. Every table, every chart. Now it's not wrong by a whole lot. It's off a little bit, not a lot." And my co-author, deeply ethical person, believer in the truth, could not allow his book, our book, to go forward with anything that he knew to be incorrect. So we had to redo every single empirical part of the book. It took us another 3 months, and we got it done. But that's an example of asymmetric information. If you are the only one who knows how you manipulated your data, then that's going to be a real problem unless you're an ethical person. And that brings us to the lack of incentives for replication. Science does not typically reward replication in economics. Now, there are exceptions. You're probably all familiar with the Herndon et al., which found errors in the Reinhardt and Rogoff growth in the time of debt paper. That's an example where some grad students were able to discover an error and make a huge name for themselves. But that is like a needle in the haystack. That is 1 in 10,000 cases. That is not the norm. So we can't really rely on replication as a credible threat. We also have, so what I'm arguing is that the probability of getting caught is very low. There's a high cost of discovery, and viewers are not asked to replicate from original sources typically, even if the authors are now required by the American Economic Association and others to submit their data set as well as their code in order to be published. And this is the last and most disheartening thing. There are very minimal repercussions for cheating in economics. First of all, you could say, "Oh, you discovered that error that turned my otherwise unstatistically significant results. Suddenly, they become, they've done something to make them statistically significant. And if you caught my error, now suddenly they're not statistically significant, you could say, oh, my bad, I'm very sorry, I didn't realize." And you get a slap on the wrist if you're discovered to having done something wrong. A journal editor will say, "You can't ever publish here." But what does that matter when there are hundreds of economics journals? And then this last thing is very sad to me. There was a survey of journal editors of the most prestigious journals asking them, what would you do if you discovered a paper that had been plagiarized and submitted for publication? And only half of those journal editors said that they would inform the department chair at the author's school. Because nobody wants the legal problems that arise from reporting such information. So I believe that the benefits of cheating are high and include possible lifetime employment through tenure. The expected costs of cheating are low, and this creates a moral hazard. And yet, as I said earlier, we don't see a lot of cheating in economics. So why? And the answer is because institutions evolve to help individuals and groups accomplish goals, and some of these are social norms relating to ethical behavior in doing economics. So we could think about duty and virtue. Most professors take what we do very seriously. We take a vow of truth-seeking through honesty and deliberation. So to be a professional is one who professes, who takes a vow in a religious order, having publicly declared a commitment to something. And this is what Frank Knight developed. He was one of the founders of the Chicago School, and he said scientific inquiry rests upon a moral code or a religion, and it's supremely important for all scientists to recognize this fact. I hope all of you teachers in here are teaching your students about this moral code. The basic tenet of scientific research, truth or objectivity, is a moral principle in opposition to any form of self-interest. So we have three kinds of ethical systems: consequentialist or outcome-based. We have duty-based deontological ethics, and we have virtue ethics. And do we need all of them? Ken Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize in 1992, said yes, we need all of them. The price system is not, and perhaps in some basic sense, cannot be universal. It is incomplete. So when we think about how the market for scientific work in economics goes, it isn't just the price system going on here. There's something else going on. The price system is incomplete. We need something else. We need to supplement the price system, that is, incentive structures. We need to supplement by an implicit or explicit social contract. Thus, one might loosely say that Kant's categorical imperative and the price system are essential complements, and that the multiplicity of control systems in the real world is probably no accident. We need all of these ethical systems. And the American Economics Association has just started a conversation about this. They are creating an ethical code for economists. It's a beginning, not an end. It's going to start the conversation. It's not going to end the conversation. And now I think I have, by my count, 12 minutes left to introduce concepts from normative economics. This is the most controversial. We may not get through it all, but here is an article that I recently wrote that will develop the arguments in greater depth. So economists talk about outcomes as being the goal that matter. In particular, we talk about economic efficiency, which is to maximize the economic surplus through exchange. And we talk about Pareto efficiency, when all voluntary trades are complete, and it's impossible to make anyone better off without making at least one person worse off. But what I'd like you to think about is, how do we justify telling our students that Pareto optimality is a good ethical approach? And even though we said economists are outcome-based ethicists, we care about outcomes, it's pretty hard to argue that when you're using the Pareto optimal approach. Because under Pareto's option, we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. There are no particular outcomes that matter. I could be a masochist. I could buy something to cause pain for myself. Somebody else could be a sadist and buy a product because they care about causing pain to somebody else. So we're really not able to say anything about any particular outcomes. People have preferences in the market to buy whatever they want to buy. And those who have the money to buy will have certain preferences. Those who don't have the money to buy do not get their preferences listened to, by the market anyway. So it's very hard to use outcomes as an example of this is why we should support Pareto optimality, because there are any particular outcomes that matter to us. Rather, we can justify Pareto optimality on the basis of Kantian duty ethics. That is, perhaps it's our obligation to treat others respectfully and to accept their right as autonomous agents to make rational choices for themselves. And we don't judge their choices, we let them make their own choices. And I've given you a link there to Mark Wight's book on Kantian ethics and economics, Autonomy, Dignity, and Character, which came out a few years ago. So, what we often teach our students is the first stab at efficiency is always Pareto efficiency. What I'm saying is, you can't justify that on the basis of outcome ethics. You typically would say, we're allowing people to make their own choices, and that shows dignity and respect for them as autonomous agents. But the problem arises because public policy is not based on Pareto optimality. Public policy typically creates some losers who would not voluntarily agree. And therefore, they have to be forced. So in the 1930s, Pareto efficiency was replaced by the concept of Calder-Hicks efficiency. And here what we would say is a policy is efficient if the winners gain more than the losers, regardless of whether compensation is paid. Now, Colombia recently joined the Pacific Alliance, and if you, like me, are a believer in trade as a way to enhance wealth, this is going to make Colombia wealthier overall. But some people are going to get hurt. A lot of the farmers who are protesting believe that they're going to get hurt. So how can we justify harming some people for the benefit of others? So what I'm trying to ask you to think about is, how could we justify causing harm to some in order to benefit others? This should be a part of the ethical training we do in economics, in micro theory. When we talk about efficiency and Calder-Hicks efficiency in public policy, we should be carrying it to this next step. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Imagine you have policy A that could cause Paolo's wealth to go up by $1,200, but Maria's goes down by $300 and Juan's wealth goes down by $300. The overall net impact of this change in policy would be to increase the economic surplus by $600. Policy B is different because, let me just finish one other point, which is, so 2/3 of the people in this example are getting hurt. And yet we would say it's a better policy, right? It's economically efficient to do this policy, even though 2/3 of the people are worse off. Because that's what all we care about when we do efficiency, is we're talking about the size of the entire economic surplus. We don't care about its distribution. But look at policy B. Policy B would increase Paolo by a lot, by $350, but Maria and Juan would not experience a negative. They would get some benefit to them. So policy B, everybody would gain something. The total economic surplus created is $550. It's almost the same as the $600. Which policy is more efficient? Policy A. Which policy maybe has a better smell test? Policy B. What I'm trying to get you to think about is that when we're talking about efficiency, it's in a particular context of causing harm to some and causing gain to others. This is the Three Gorges Dam in China. 1.2 million peasants were forcibly relocated. 1,300 archaeological sites were flooded. There was a loss of biodiversity. The economists who are working on this project claim that the wealth created by this more than compensates for the losses caused to the 1.2 million people. But 1.2 million people had their lives turned upside down. They were given new houses, but the question is, would they have voluntarily preferred to get the new house or stay in their old house? Many of them would have chosen to stay in their old house, even though they would have been maybe poor. So I think you can see where this is going. Here is the gentleman standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square. And here are pro-democracy advocates in Hong Kong in 2014. What I'm trying to get at is, if we're talking about Calder-Hicks efficiency, in which we're going to be causing harm to some people, it would be very nice to know that we had in place certain institutions that protect the rights of those who are getting harmed. These are policies and processes that don't enable some to run roughshod over others. And so what I would... So what I would ask us to think about, if we had time, we'd talk about Larry Summers' infamous memo at the World Bank, where he talked about moving the polluting industries to Africa because there is lower opportunity cost of polluting there because lives are less valuable economically. And this memo, by the way, was written as an ironic joke. Nobody would really write this. And yet it was taken as serious and caused a huge uproar because it failed to consider treating Africans as true and complete human beings whose human rights should be considered. So where does this leave us with Calder-Hicks? Well, first of all, I'm a great believer in economics and what we can do for society. And I also believe that it has to be understood in the right context. And when we're talking about causing harm to some people, we want to make sure that there are basic human rights in place, that there are fair and impartial judges who can hear appeals, that the judges are honorable and virtuous, that there is a courageous free press who can report abuses, that there's a fair and democratic elections to settle our differences peaceably. And when you're endorsing Calder-Hicks and saying, I'm a believer in efficiency, you're saying, I believe that we have a process in place that can make the nation richer while also respecting the rights of those who get injured in the process. And doing development work of any kind is very, very hard. And the hardest kind of development work is reforming the rules of the game. Chico Mendes was an environmentalist who was assassinated in 1988 in Brazil. There have been many, many priests and nuns also murdered around the world for their work. And the latest data I have for 2012 was 136 journalists were killed, 879 were arrested, almost 2,000 were threatened or attacked, 38 were kidnapped, and 73 had to flee their countries. So, if the educational goal is to prepare future leaders, to do this, students must learn to deal respectively with complexity and controversy. David Colander has said the art of doing economics is contextual and is much dependent on non-economic judgments, such as about the ethics, as it is about economics. Paul Samuelson, who I learned economics way back in the 70s, from his famous textbook, wrote, "Economic science arms one for the great debate. It does not preclude that debate or prejudice its conclusions." So I actually have 1 minute left to summarize. I hope what I have done today is help you with a conversation that I think has been going on already, to provide some perspectives. Again, I'm not an expert on Colombia, and I have no desire to interfere with the choices that you are making. My claim is that if you can better understand different ethical frameworks, it can help you understand the real world that we're dealing with, and it can help you make the world a little bit better. And I think Adam Smith would agree with that. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for the talk. So we have some questions. I'm going to try to simplify some of them. So if the person who wrote the question, I'm changing it too much, just raise your hand and clarify it as much as you can. Okay? So the first question is, what should be done about firms that are acting within the law but that are violating moral convictions? One example is Zara, H&M. And why doesn't an aware society punish moral violations through their consumption levels in those morally damaged markets?
I apologize, I'm a little hard of hearing, so I didn't quite understand.
Okay, so I will read it out loud, or you can read it.
Maybe just part of it, and then I can...
Okay, so the question is, what should be done about companies that are acting within the law but are violating moral convictions, such as H&M and Zara?
Such as what?
H&M, this very famous brand of clothes, and Zara. And why doesn't an aware society punish moral violations through their consumption levels in those morally damaged markets? Do consumers actually care about moral restraints when maximizing their utility?
Oh, these are wonderful, wonderful questions. And I share the moral sympathy of where that question is arising from. There are a lot of examples of companies behaving very immorally, and they're in violation either of the law or of the spirit of the law, and in some cases they go against the basic moral sympathy that we tend to have. The question is whether or not consumers can or should do anything about it. And at least in the United States, I think there is plenty of examples of companies that care very much to be perceived as being an ethical company. That's different from saying they're ethical. There are many companies who want to be perceived as being, for example, a green company, meaning you care about the environment. Now, there are some companies that care a great deal, and it's the leader of that company actually behaves in a way that demonstrates their commitment to certain principles. This is the kind of discussion that you would have in a business MBA course, which I'll be teaching this summer, and I can send you a reading list or something like that of how some business leaders are inspired by the idea that they can make the world a better place. I'm not saying that that is everybody or that is even most people, but that's some people. And the extent to which consumers can play a role in changing that depends entirely on the market structure. If the market is competitive, if there's pretty good information, if there's pretty good visibility, then I think given social media today, campaigns could be run so as to shame or embarrass a company to try to do a better job.
And then here are two questions, but I'm going to pick one of the two. Is how effective is to teach ethics in a classroom?
Well, in my own case, very effective. Which is to say, I don't try to teach ethics. I try to allow students to discover ethics. There's a difference. So my job when I'm doing a class is not to lecture them about this is ethical, that is not ethical. Rather, my job is to, as a professor, is to create a learning environment. And I tell my students it's like going to a restaurant where there's a buffet of ideas. and you go to the restaurant and you sample, I'm going to try some of this, I'm going to try some of this, I'm going to try some of this, I'm going to eat it. If I like it, I'm going to get some more. If I don't like it, I'm going to spit it out. So it's not my job to teach anybody ethics. It's their job to learn ethics if they want to. My job is to create a learning environment to expose them to Adam Smith, expose them to Kant, expose them to Jeremy Bentham, expose them to Amartya Sen, to some of these other leaders, and allow them to taste them and see where they're going. Does this inspire you? Does this motivate you in some way? Let's have an argument. Let's have a debate. And with great respect for those who have a very different opinion than me, because my job is not to have them think like me, but to have them think. And so that's the way I do ethics. I don't try. And Adam Smith, by the way, quite explicitly says, if you want young people to learn ethics, don't get them to be taught by philosophers. I apologize to all the philosophers in the room. I would love to include myself as a philosopher, but I wasn't smart enough. But Adam Smith said, if you really want to help someone learn what it means to live an ethical life, expose them to the humanities, to great literature, to the opera, to works of art, which, by the way, I've had a couple of wonderful days at the Botero Museum and other museums around town, just magnificent. And what Smith said is that the arts inspire your moral imagination. You know, Botero's paintings of the violencia and the gorillas, they inspire something in us to think. And it's that process of engaging the moral imagination that gets people to think about ethical issues. And reading the philosophers, they have the good theory, but it's not quite the same as getting your heart moved, according to Adam Smith.
Okay, and the last question, which I'm going to change it, is if economists or economics should decide whether to help rich people that create or make jobs, or should economists help poor people to solve their poverty problems? Because that there's
wow, that is very tough. I am generally a believer in markets. I like markets in the Adam Smith sense that if a market has the right characteristics, then I tend to like it. And that would include good competition, good information flows, transparency, etc. There are no barriers to trade that allow some people to get rich at the expense of other people through their connections in government. So in that sense, I'm a great believer in markets. I also do worry about the moral limits to markets in some cases. But being a believer in markets is different than saying I'm a believer in trickle-down theory, which I think is what this question is about. That is the idea that if you create, as we just did in the United States, the tax law that went into effect this year was a huge tax cut to the very wealthy. And the goal of this is the idea that this will trickle down, the benefits will trickle down to people at the bottom. I don't think there's any evidence that that has happened in the past. We've had examples under President Reagan and under President Bush. And in both of those situations, we did have a demand stimulus, which is traditional Keynesian economics. You cut taxes, you get a demand stimulus. There is no evidence that we had a supply-side stimulus that would pay for it. So what we're doing in the United States, I do not support, which is a tax cut on the rich, with the promise that this will lead to more investment and more growth that will pay for itself. As it is, the budget deficit is, over the next 10 years will grow by, I think, $1.5 trillion. And that means we don't have the money to invest in infrastructure, and we don't have the money to pay for healthcare. Both of those, to my opinion, are better at stimulating the supply side of the economy, as well as the demand side of the economy, than tax cuts. But it all is contextual. Because right now the marginal tax rate in the United States, I think, is at 39% or something. That compares to, in the 1960s, the marginal tax rate was over 70%. So in that context, lowering the marginal tax rate, maybe you would see a very big gain. But when the marginal tax rate is much lower, I'm not anticipating much gain. So with regard to the second part of the question, I do think many of us got into economics because we want to say we can make the world a better place. In fact, they asked Nobel laureates why they got into economics, and I think roughly half of them said they wanted to make the world a better place. And clearly helping create economic development that would benefit people at the bottom is something like that. Adam Smith certainly had that strong connection to people at the bottom that he wanted to try to make life better for. How to do that is very complicated. Should we do that through markets? Should we do that through some other kinds of education or healthcare or some other kinds of handouts? It's a very complicated issue, which obviously I'm not going to be able to settle.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your talk. Pleasure.